Good evening, everyone. Good evening and good afternoon from people joining from Europe, and good morning for people joining from the United States and the other part of the world. Uh, we are delighted to have you with us for this 3 week intensive training program on trade and investment, jointly organized by Indian National Association of Legal Professionals, New Delhi, and International Law Institute, Washington, D.C. I'll just give you a brief introduction about what INALP, the Indian National Association of Legal Professionals, is, and then my colleague, my senior colleague Patrick, will be telling you about International Law Institute and what was the motive behind like putting this uh, training program up. So we were discussing in the starting of this year, we were discussing to have a on ground conference in India with partnership with ministries and other relevant bodies on trade and investment, because there is a lot happening in the this sphere, but because of COVID-19 we were not able to do that. So that's also one of the reasons that's why we have this training program for all of you. About INALP. INALP is a legal industry body, and we are working towards the upliftment and like capacity building of lawyers in India with the help of international expertise from different parts of the world. We are now 1 year old body. We started in 2019, and with the support of partners like the International Law Institute, with whom we have an interinstitutional partnership. We are doing great programs on capacity building of lawyers, young lawyers, most probably judges very soon. We discussed about that also, and students. So this is what we are doing. Our main areas of working are trade and investment, climate change, human rights, but they are not limited to. So we are working on various reports. We are submitting recommendations to the government, be it data privacy bill, be it drones bill, be it anything. And we have different sections, committees. We are having a strong membership database. We are a membership driven organization with head office in Delhi, and now the other office is coming up very soon in Chandigarh. So we look forward to have you as a part of our like membership database, and also a part of our programs, and much more programs we'll be doing for you all. And we look forward to like your questions, the engaging discussion during this program. And thank you so much for being a part of this training program. And I hope this will be fruitful for you and all of us actually. And over to you, Patrick. Now, please take the
lead. Thank you very much, Manoj. And thank you for your extraordinary organization of this course. Very impressive. I'm told that more than 100 people have signed up already. And you've got a wonderful group of speakers from India. So I think this should be very, very interesting. Let me just say a few words about the International Law Institute. We're quite old. We've been around for over 60 years. We were originally part of Georgetown University Law School. We're now independent, but we still have very close ties with Georgetown. We're basically teaching and doing capacity development. We offer a wide range of courses on legal and business subjects. Trade is the area that I'm in charge of, but we cover things like alternative dispute settlement, public-private partnerships, etc. So that is good. In terms of the US speakers, we've got a range of them. Most of them have had experience in the government, so they know the inside story, we hope. And I think you should find that quite interesting. Now, in terms of comments, obviously we can't have comments or questions live. There are too many people on this course. So we'd ask you to use the chat function. When I'm speaking, I'll try to answer them as they come up, but there may be too many, in which case, if we may find some time later on to deal with those. I think the schedule is fairly self-explanatory. As I think you know, this week we're going to be covering the basics of trade. This is designed mainly for people who don't have a great deal of background. And then the second and third weeks will be more advanced topics, particularly a strong focus on India's trade policy with its major trading partners, and subjects like trade and labor, trade and e-commerce, and so forth. So that's basically where we are. I want to start by saying that when I started doing trade, wait a minute, sorry, technical issue with a share screen. Sorry. Give me a second. There we go. When I started doing work in the trade field, very few people did it. It wasn't taught in law schools. You sort of picked it up as you went along. There was this obscure organization called the GATT in Geneva, very hard to get information. It has totally changed in the last 20 or 30 years. And I just want to summarize a few of those changes. First of all, of course, the creation of the World Trade Organization. It was the Uruguay run was a remarkable achievement. This is what it produced. Over 100 countries managed to sit down and negotiate a whole series of agreements on trade. Very importantly, the GATT, the original agreement, only covered trade in goods. The WTO now covers services and intellectual property, and we'll be looking at those in some detail next week. China obviously has been a huge factor. It became a member in 2001, and obviously there'll be a lot to discuss later in the course. The Soviet Union broke up and is no longer a communist country. Huge revolution in transport and communications. They've become much more available, much cheaper, and this has had a huge impact on trade. In particular, I'm going to show you the next slide. We'll come back. A very interesting slide. Somebody took an iPhone, not the most current one, but one of the earlier versions, and they just took it apart. And if you take a look at that, it is a value chain. The parts are coming from many different countries, and the only thing that actually happens in China is that it is assembled by Foxconn, and the total value of the assembly is about $6.50. It distorts trade because it's coming in, when it comes into the United States from China, it's valued at its full value. So it looks like a $300 deficit with China, but it's not. It's a deficit with all these other countries. So that's a very important. The latest statistics from the WTO show that more than half of international trade now is basically in the form of value chains. Now, wait a minute, just need to go back. Obviously, the other big thing is regional trade agreements, as I'm sure you know. Just on Friday, the RCEP, the regional trade agreement led by China, was signed. And that's it's one of the largest free trade agreements in the world, covering many countries. India, of course, decided not to join, though it'll be interesting to hear from the Indian speakers next week whether there's a likelihood that India will try to come in at some point. Non-government organizations are playing a much more important role in trade. They're advising, particularly the poorer developing countries. Another interesting, developing countries traditionally have had high tariffs, India being a good example. India, of course, also had many quotas, but many of them now are lowering tariffs because they see the advantages, which we'll look at in a few minutes. The other important development were a couple, the increased importance of non-tariff barriers. Tariffs, when they were high, you didn't really worry about non-tariff barriers because you couldn't overcome the high tariff. But with tariffs, they've come down a great deal. And now non-tariff barriers, regulations, etc., are much more important. And they're much harder to deal with, to get rid of. But for example, the possible US-EU free trade agreement, tariffs really are not important in trade between the United States and Europe. The tariffs are very low, not as low on agricultural products, but certainly on manufactured goods. And the real problem is non-tariff barriers, different requirements for cars, for example, different safety requirements, different pollution requirements. And that is a big problem, which we'll see. And then obviously, President Trump, still our president, he's obviously really shaken up the international trading system in a big way, going for bilateral agreements rather than multilateral, pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, renegotiating the original NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, renegotiating Korea, and various other trade actions. What the next president will produce, we don't know, but we'll talk about this. The next speaker later this morning will be addressing that. So these are just some of the many, many changes that have happened. It's a huge, really a revolution. Okay, the WTO is unique among international organizations. And again, we'll look at these in more detail, but it is the only institution that I know of that decides by consensus. One country not agreeing can block anything. In 2003, at the Cancun ministerial meeting, The first country to walk out was Botswana, not a major country in trade terms, but once it pulled out, there was no hope of getting any kind of agreement. It also has binding dispute settlement with some enforcement power. We'll look at this a little more this morning, but more importantly, we'll go into that in detail next week. Again, I don't know of any other international organization that has enforcement power. Even the International Court of Justice can't enforce its decisions. They're really like advisory opinions. So that's important. And also compulsory jurisdiction, again, with the going back to the International Court in The Hague, countries that join decide for themselves what type of cases they will allow to be decided. So these are very important, and it gives the organization a great deal of power. Now, reciprocity. This is the key concept underlying the GATT WTO system, that tariff reductions, the idea of the system is to get tariffs down as low as possible or even eliminate them, and they're made on a balanced basis. Now, there is an exception for developing countries. They're not expected to provide complete reciprocity. But the idea is that when you're negotiating a trade agreement, you try to balance it so that countries don't run into balance of payments problems. And if a country violates the rules, it is supposed to compensate the harmed country by giving it some other trade concession to keep the trade in balance. That's a very, very important concept. Just to give you an idea, let's assume that long before the GATT WTO, the US and France enter a trade agreement. And what does France want to sell to the United States? Wine, of course, because France produces a lot of wine, very good wine. And so they reckon if the US lowers its tariff on wine from, let's say, I'm just making these numbers up, 30% to 15%, imports of wine in the United States will increase by $10 billion, which is great for the French wine growers, not so good for the American wine growers, wine producers. But in return, the US wants reciprocity. So they have worked out that if France lowers its tariff on cars from 25 to 13%, imports will increase by $10 billion. So you've got more trade, you've got more competition, but there's no change in the trade balance. And that is the idea. And very importantly, the first agreement, the GATT, which was basically a tariff cutting agreement, we'll go into that in a little more detail in a few minutes, contains rules of good behavior to prevent countries from nullifying or impairing benefits. So let's say France has lowered its tariff on cars, but then it passes a regulation imposing some kind of excise tax on large cars. Well, the large cars are mostly US. So they make it impossible for the United States to get its $10 billion increase. And so the idea of these rules, and these are the fundamental rules, you all have heard of most favored nation, I'm sure you've all heard of national treatment, the ban on quotas, these are designed to make sure, and the technical term is nullification or impairment of benefits expected to arise from the trade agreement. Those benefits being increased trade, increased exports. So that's the idea. Quick timeline, we'll go into some more detail, but just to give you a sense of what was happening. Free trade agreements began to be made in Europe in the mid-19th century. We'll explain why. So trade increased, but then in 1929-33, the Great Depression caused a huge trade disruption. Countries imposed quotas, high tariffs, etc. And then the big change happened in 1934. The United States started entering free trade agreements. These were bilateral. I think the first one was with Mexico, but again, the same concept that we just discussed of reciprocity. The idea is we'll enter a free trade agreement, we'll lower tariffs, and we'll increase trade, but we'll do it on a reciprocal basis. 1947, the GATT was basically a multilateralized free trade agreement, lowering tariffs, and then in 1995, the WTO was established. So it gives just a sense. Okay, now I've listed here some useful websites. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but there is a huge amount of material. The WTO website is very good. It was not very user-friendly, but it's become much, much better. There's a massive information, so that's useful. There are a lot of organizations that produce reports on trade issues, and I've listed some here. This is the WTO website, some of the useful information there. Now, sometimes I look at international trade as really there are three levels of law which govern international trade transactions. The first is the private one. Let's suppose an Indian battery maker enters an agreement with a US company to sell batteries. Well, there will obviously be a contract, an agreement, and that's just a private matter. You know, how many are you going to sell? What's the price going to be? What are the conditions, etc. That's it. Now, on top of that, there will be government regulations. There will undoubtedly be, the US will have safety regulations, maybe labeling regulations, probably impose import duties. There may be some restrictions on the Indian side. So that's the second level. The third level, and that's what we're going to be talking about in the next 2 or 3 weeks, what I call the super government. These are rules set by the governments themselves, indicating how much they can limit or regulate trade. And the important thing about them is that the goal of the international trade rules is to minimize government interference. This is basically Adam Smith. The best way to allocate scarce economic resources is through competition. So we let the market forces operate as much as possible. We realize that that isn't always the case. There are reasons, which we'll go into in a few minutes, as to why countries restrict trade. But the whole idea is, and most of the rules in the GATT and WTO are negative rules, things that you can't do. You can't impose quotas. You can't raise tariffs above the level that you've agreed to, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's an important concept. Okay, let's talk for a few minutes about the why we trade. Well, they're both economic and political reasons for trade, advantages, if you like. On the economic side, we get economies of scale. The more you produce, the lower the unit cost, and therefore the lower the price to the consumer. And this is a very important aspect of the auto industry, is a very an area where economies of scale are very important. Now, you can see that a country that has absolute advantage, where it's cheaper. The United States, for example, is not very good at growing bananas. We don't have the right climate. We need hot houses. It would be expensive. But we're very good at growing wheat and corn because we've got the area, we've got the flat land, and the climate's right. A little island in the Caribbean, St. Lucia, is not very good at growing wheat and corn. It's mountainous and it's very small, but they're very good at bananas. So you'd expect to see trade in bananas, and because each country has an absolute advantage in those particular products. But the really important concept, and this was developed by an English economist called David Ricardo in the late 18th, possibly the early 19th century, called comparative advantage. And this demonstrates in a very simple way why trade is good, even if you don't have an absolute advantage. And let me go to the next slide. And this is the example he used. He compared England and Portugal, and he took two products, cloth and wine, and he said, right, let's assume that in England it requires 3 person-hours to produce a bale of cloth and 6 person-hours to produce a barrel of wine. In Portugal, in each case, it's only 2 person-hours. So you can see that England is at a disadvantage in terms of the labor requirement to Portugal. So you might ask, why trade? Why would Portugal be interested in importing cloth from England when it requires more labor to produce? But the maths are very simple. Let's suppose England has 24 person-hours. If it doesn't trade, if it is self-sufficient, it could produce 4 cloth and 2 wine. And likewise, Portugal could produce 3 cloth and 9 wine with the person-hours available. But what happens if England focuses on the product where it has a comparative advantage, because it only requires 50% more labor to produce cloth, but it requires 3 times as much to produce wine. So if England focuses on where it has comparative advantage, it could produce 8 cloth, and Portugal, focusing on wine, could produce 12 wine. So magically, we've gone from 7 cloth without trade to 8 cloth, and we've gone from 11 wine to 12 wine. Interestingly, Paul Samuelson, who was one of the great US economists, he was once challenged by a mathematician to name one proposition of all the social sciences that is both true and non-trivial. And he came up with the law of comparative advantage. He said that is logically true need not be argued before a mathematician. That is not trivial is attested by the thousands of important and intelligent men who have never been able to grasp the doctrine for themselves or to believe it after it's explained to them. So there are many more complicated rules or that justify international trade, but comparative advantage is still very important. Now, another advantage is that increased competition from imports, it spurs efficiency and it benefits consumers. It requires the domestic producers to be more efficient and produce products. The auto industry, a good example. The Japanese came into the market, the US market in the 1980s, and produced much better cars. And the US industry has really had to shape up and do a better job. Another thing, it encourages foreign direct investment, which particularly for developing countries is very important, and transfer of technology. Now, I want to move on to the next slide, which is political, which is an area that people don't think nearly as much about, the political advantages of trade. And the notion is economic integration, where you, to some extent, integrate your economy with another country. There's going to be less political tension. Countries will know each other better. There will be less tension. Cordell Hull, a great name in trade, I think the greatest name. He was Secretary of State under President Roosevelt, FDR, in 1934 on. And he said, unhampered trade dovetailed with peace, high tariffs, trade barriers, and unfair competition, war. That seems pretty extreme, but think about it. Why did the Japanese attack the United States at Pearl Harbor? It wasn't, I think, because they thought they could conquer the United States. There weren't enough, 50 million people against 300 million. Now, the idea was that the US was not pleased with the way the Japanese were behaving in Asia with China and other countries. And they imposed an embargo on, I think it was oil and rubber, refused to sell to the Japanese. So the Japanese struck at Pearl Harbor, hoping that this would lead to some kind of settlement. So there's an example of a war which began entirely as a result of trade restrictions. A more recent example is Ukraine. The Russians moved into Ukraine because Ukraine was discussing a trade agreement with the EU and they didn't like it. Now, the other side of the coin is the European Union. And again, people tend to think of that more in terms of the economic advantages, of which there are many. But the real reason that the EU came into effect was to prevent another war in Europe. Remember, there have been 3 in the last 70 years, starting with the Franco-Prussian War and then the 2 world wars. And the idea, in fact, the treaty on coal and steel, which was the first step towards the EU, actually talks about ending the century of bloody strife, which is not usual language for international agreements. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, certainly some economic advantages, but the US basically wanted a prosperous and stable neighbor. They hoped that the agreement would improve Mexico's economic situation because to cut down on immigration, and they didn't want a left-wing government on their border. The tariff of abominations, interestingly, in 1830, the Northern-dominated Congress in the United States put high tariffs on machinery, which basically required the Southerners to buy machinery from the Northern United States rather than importing it from Europe. And they actually threatened civil war. It was a very close call, 30 years before the Civil War actually did happen. And the other thing that is interesting, trade agreements often lead to political union. The United States, the 13 colonies, they had trade agreements between each other, but they had separate currency and separate currency. England and Scotland had a free trade agreement 100 years before the 2 countries became under a single monarchy. Germany and Switzerland, these are other examples, and Italy, these started with free trade agreements. Now, just another question. Why does the United States have free trade agreements with countries like Israel, Bahrain, Jordan, Oman, and now we're negotiating with Kenya? Is it the economic advantages? Not really. I think we import a few $1 million from Jordan. No, this is rewarding the people who have helped us in terms of terrorism. And Israel is an obvious example. So that's another example of the politics that lie behind these. I've just got a couple of quick charts to look at. There's very strong evidence that opening up to trade leads to more growth. There's a chart based on the World Bank statistics. I think you can, I don't need to go into detail on that. And then there's another very interesting chart which demonstrates there's quite a clear correlation between economic freedom and openness to trade. Okay, so why do we restrict trade? Cynics would say it's to keep trade lawyers like myself in business, and certainly the the Trump approach to trade has created a huge amount of work for trade lawyers in the United States. One is security, food self-sufficiency. Japan has justified its very high tariffs on rice by saying, look, we're an island. If there's a war, we won't be able to import food. Strategic industries. We restrict exports of strategic materials. And of course, in the last couple of years, President Trump has imposed tariffs on imports of steel and aluminium for you. I'm trying to learn to speak the right way. Impose tariffs on the ground that these strategic industries. They've been challenged. There's a lot of question about whether they really are strategic, whether there's justification, but that is an example. The EU, as I'm sure you know, has in the past had a very restrictive common agricultural policy with very high restrictions on imports, and they justified the term multifunctionality, and it's sort of to protect the traditional way of life. Farmers get up early in the morning, and therefore they must be morally good people, and protecting the environment, etc. But very often it's to protect weak industries, and that's all about jobs, because obviously people who have jobs or lose their jobs have representatives in their parliament, and they make a lot of noise. Steel is a classic example. Almost half of the anti-dumping and counterfeiting duty cases in the United States have involved steel products because they're very powerful and they're scattered around the country, so they have strong political force. Politics, the farm lobby is very influential. And one example I give is sugar. It's a very small part of total agriculture, but they have worked out that for every $1,000 they give in campaign contributions, they are rewarded with import quotas worth $1 million. So they're getting 1,000 times return on their investment. Countering unfair trade practices, obviously very important, and India particularly, which we'll come to later when we look at these trade remedy laws, countering unfair trade practices like dumping, counterfeiting duties, etc. And then balance of payments. There's an exception in the GATT, which we'll look at tomorrow, where a country has balance of payments problems, it can impose restrictions on trade. Let's give you an eye on the time. Now, one of the interesting features of this GATT-WTO system is, on the one hand, and the GATT, as we'll see, was basically a diplomatic agreement between a number of countries in Geneva. These are diplomats. Diplomats don't like litigation. They don't like disputes. They like to work things out. Let's try to compromise. And that's fine. On the other hand, if you're in business, subject to trade rules, you want predictable and stable rules. You don't want a situation where some bureaucrat in the Ministry of Commerce is going to basically sell you out because they want a more peaceful life and not to deal with disputes. And you see that throughout the agreement. As we'll see, it's become much more predictable, more stable, more legalistic, but there are still vestiges of this idea of a diplomatic trade. Now, to show you, I was amused by this. This is the very first dispute settlement ruling. And again, we'll look at this in more detail next week, but this is the first, in its entirety, it's one sentence long. No reasoning, no explanation for why the chairman ruled the way he did, just simply a ruling. Well, today, as I'm sure any of you have been involved in trade know, dispute settlement decisions by the panels and then the appellate body are often thousands of pages long. And again, we'll look at that. So it's really changed. The lawyers, I would say the lawyers really have triumphed. It's a very important, very legalistic now. Okay, let's look a little more at the history of free trade. It really began in the 19th century, and I'm glad to say that it was the UK that really started this. The reason was political reform. Up until 1832, the first Political Reform Act, politics were governed by the landowners, the rich, the aristocrats, and they didn't want free trade. They didn't want cheap corn and wheat coming in from the continent. They wanted to keep the tariffs high. But then, as a result of political reform, the middle classes, manufacturers started to have some political power. Well, now they wanted to sell their machinery overseas, but in order to do that, to get countries to lower their tariffs to British machinery, Britain had to give something, the reciprocal idea, and so they had to make concessions, bringing down tariffs on wheat. So the very first agreement was with France, the so-called Cobden-Chevalier agreement. And within a few years, The UK exports to France had doubled, and importation of French wines into Britain doubled. So again, that's a good example. And then more and more trade agreements throughout Europe. The US did not join in this move. It was protecting its infant industries. Then we get to World War I, and I'm sure you're very familiar with President Wilson's 14 points. And one of them did deal with trade. As you can see, the first quote, removal as far as possible all economic barriers and the establishment of equalized trade conditions. The problem was that was a nice idea, but there were no detailed rules or institutions. The League of Nations talked about equitable treatment, but nothing more than that. And that was a big problem. In the 1930s, as you know, the Great Depression led to huge trade distortion. Countries were running balance of payments deficits. So in order to lessen the effect, they restricted imports. The United States passed a law called Smoot-Hawley, a bad name in trade, which raised the average tariff on imports to the United States by 50%. And they started subsidizing exports to try to increase their revenue, foreign revenue. So that was a huge problem. Trade, 70% of world trade was subject to quotas, and world trade contracted in 5 years from 5.3 billion to 1.8 billion. Absolutely disastrous, and of course totally contrary to all the economic and indeed political reasons for having free trade. But how do you do that? Is one country going to step forward and say, right, we will do the right thing, we'll lower our tariffs, hoping that other countries will do the same thing? I wouldn't want to be the government official who made that decision. So that's where Cordell Hull comes in. In 1934, he began this notion of free trade agreements, bilateral free trade agreements, just like the example we looked at of France and the United States, reciprocal tariff cutting agreements. The first, I think I mentioned with Mexico. And by 1940, we had a whole series, I think about 30 such agreements. Now, meanwhile, when the United States came into World War II, it was clear that the Allies were going to win the war. It's just a question really of timing. And so, as you know, the US and the UK, and to some extent France, I think, started planning for post-World War II. And there were going to be three institutions: the World Bank, which would basically help the war-torn countries reestablish, like Germany and Japan; the IMF, which was really a lender, and then the International Trade Organization, which probably many of you have never heard of. And the reason was it would have looked very much like the WTO today, but the United States backed off and it wasn't ratified. And so there was no point without the United States, which of course was the dominant economic power after World War II. And so it died. It was agreed in the Havana Charter, 1947. Now, meanwhile, it would take a while if the ITO went ahead. It would take several years probably for it to be ratified by the various members. And so, meanwhile, a number of countries, 23 countries, got together in Geneva to agree on a simple tariff cutting exercise to try to kickstart the world economy. And so 23 countries got together, mostly the developed countries, but a number of developing countries. Iraq, I think, was one of the first, and other countries. And the idea was this would be a temporary agreement, cutting tariffs, and once the International Trade Organization came into effect, it would be superseded. The GATT would be superseded by the ITO. Now, very importantly, this is the key point about the GATT. It was tariff cuts, but it also contained these rules of good behavior to make sure that countries lived up to their obligations, their promises they'd made in cutting their tariffs. They would cut a tariff, let's say, from 15 to 5%, but then they wouldn't take some other action which would nullify or impair the benefits of those tariff cuts. And those are the rules that are in force today, the GATT rules. And now the GATT is one of the WTO agreements. It's been absorbed by the WTO. So that's absolutely critical. And that's what we'll be looking at later in the week, the rules of good behavior. What did the GATT achieve? Well, there were 8 rounds of tariff cutting, and I've just listed them here. We don't need to go through them. But initially, as you can see, it was basically tariffs. It was just an exercise in reducing and reducing and reducing. But then by the 1960s, it started looking at other issues that were also restricting trade: anti-dumping, customs valuation. The US had a very, very protectionist customs valuation system for certain products, rubber products and shoes, I think. Tokyo Round, going a little bit further, again tariff cutting, but also non-tariff barrier codes, which were optional, but designed to reduce regulations and other actions that restricted trade. Then, of course, the Uruguay Round, which was huge. As I mentioned, it established the WTO, brought in services and intellectual, and it greatly strengthened the dispute settlement mechanism, as I'll explain in a few minutes. The major achievement of the GATT, and this is huge, the average developed country tariff on manufactured goods was reduced from over 40% to less than 4%. And that's enormous. And without that, we wouldn't have had the enormous increase in trade that we've had since World War II. And I'll show you a slide in a moment. And in a number of products, the tariff has been reduced to zero. There's no tariff on aircraft, for example, pharmaceutical products or IT products. So it's an enormous achievement. And that just shows you the growth. I hope you can read that. It's a little bit faint, but you can see the enormous growth in world trade, which could not have happened with 40% tariffs. It's a really critical, critical aspect. So it was a huge achievement. However, there's always a however. Sorry, I'm just getting my notes out, the right page. So it did have a lot of weaknesses. First of all, it only covered trade in goods. It didn't cover trade in services. Why? Because in 1947, the essential elements for trade in services, which are transportation and telecom, were very primitive. I mean, how would I have got to India in 1947 to deliver this in person if we didn't have the pandemic? I think that's fairly obvious. And again, we'll look at it in more detail later on. Textiles were outside the system. Textiles have always been a difficult trade subject because while manufactured, developed countries kept quite large textile industries, at the same time it was an area that developing countries who wanted to move into manufacturing, often textiles was a fairly easy way to start. So there were separate agreements which basically were managed trade. Importing countries could impose quotas, etc. There were big exceptions for agriculture. We talked about the political power that farmers have, and it's always been a difficult subject in trade. And then waivers. The United States asked the GATT for a waiver for a particular agricultural program which didn't fit within the exceptions. It was clearly illegal under the GATT rules. So the United States asked for a waiver. Well, what happened? They got the waiver. Why? Because the 600-pound gorilla usually gets what it wants. So that's not good. Then Switzerland asked for a waiver for one of its programs. Switzerland got it. Why? Not because it's a major trading, well, it's important, but not that important. But where is the GATT based? In Geneva. And the officials there didn't, or the members did not want French farmers dumping loads of manure outside their building, which actually did happen later on. And as we've seen, as I mentioned, as tariffs came down, non-tariff became more important. As a friend of mine used to say, when you lower the swamp, nasty things start appearing. And so countries which no longer had high tariffs were looking for other ways to restrict imports. And so you had these all kinds of regulations which are discriminatory. And again, we'll look at this later on. The other very weak area was dispute settlement. Remember that the fundamental principle of the GATT was consensus. Everybody had to agree. So let's suppose that France decides to bring a case against, or let's say the United States decides to bring a case against India. And so the United States goes to the GATT and says, we'd like a panel, please. Well, before a panel can be set up, the entire organization, the GATT, has to agree. And India says, no, go away. And so there's no panel. Now, India might think they had a very strong case, and they say, yeah, we'd like to win this one. We'll show the United States that our lawyers are better than their lawyers, etc. Well, so the panel is set up, and it actually rules in favor of the United States. But before that opinion becomes effective, then there has to be consensus. And India say, no, we don't accept it, and therefore it goes away. So you can see quite a weak system. And also the decisions were made, certainly in the early days, mostly by diplomats in Geneva because of transportation doing in their spare time. And the decisions weren't very consistent. There was a tendency to sort of give some to the complainant and some to the respondent. So not terribly helpful. So what happens next? Okay, so now we have the World Trade Organization, a huge, huge achievement. You know, January 1st, 1995, there are now 164 members, and there are another 21 countries, mostly very small developing countries, which are in the accession process. As you know, it's based in Geneva. It's very small compared with the World Bank, which I think has 10,000 employees, only 640, and it has a small budget, 200 million, lower than Oxfam, which plays quite an important part in trade issues. And it covers virtually all of world trade now. We talked about this, the uniqueness of it, so we don't need to go through that again. And what does it do? Well, it administers the trade agreements, the ones that came into effect as a result of the Uruguay Round. It's a forum for trade negotiations. That's one of the major functions, to continue this process of lowering trade barriers and improving trade. Unfortunately, as you know, it's only tried that once with Doha, and Doha was an almost complete failure. I'll talk about this in a few minutes. The other major function was dispute settlement. And as we'll see again, it was greatly strengthened, the dispute settlement system. And most people will say it's been very effective. Unfortunately, at the moment, the United States is not agreeing to members of the appellate body. So the system really is, at the moment, in abeyance. There's no serious dispute settlement at the moment, but that may change with the new administration. It monitors national trade policies and puts out reports, which are very helpful. If you're dealing with another country, go and look for their national trade policy. They're very detailed and so forth, and technical assistance. But the point is, there are two major functions. Trade negotiations, it's failed, and we'll talk again about this for the future, and dispute settlement is now not working at all. So, how does it work? Well, every 2 years, there's a ministerial conference where the trade ministers get together somewhere and basically make the big decisions. For example, the Doha round was called Doha because it began at the ministerial conference which was held in Doha. The next one this year was supposed to take place in Kazakhstan. Of course, it hasn't because of the pandemic. Kazakhstan has said, well, we can do it next year, but I don't think there's been a decision yet. There's a general council, which is made up of the country representatives, permanent representatives to the WTO, and they conduct the regular business. And then there's a whole series of subsidiary councils on the different agreements on services and on intellectual property. Decision-making, again, it confirms consensus is the normal way of doing it. There is a provision that you can have majority voting, but it's never actually happened. Consensus is still the norm. Don't need to go through this in detail, but this is just the way it's organized. By the way, the basic agreement establishing the WTO is known as the Marrakesh Agreement, because again, of course, that's where it was signed. And then you have these subsidiary agreements covering the agreements on trade and goods, services, intellectual property, dispute settlement, and then plurilaterals. Again, we don't need to go through this. We've been looking at these in detail this week, but these are the basic trade and goods agreements, as you can see, a lot of them. And then they were so-called plurilateral. What does that mean? Well, plurilateral basically is an agreement that it's a voluntary agreement. The countries are not required. Or the other agreements we've looked at, these were the so-called single undertaking, that you sign one, then you sign them all. You can't pick and choose as you could under the earlier trade negotiation agreements, particularly the Tokyo round. Countries could pick and choose which agreements they wanted to sign. But there were two agreements that developing countries weren't willing to go along with: government procurement, which is rather important, and we'll look at that later on this week, and civil aircraft, which is really, frankly, not really important. There's also something called the Information Technology Agreement. 29 countries of Singapore, the first ministerial, agreed to drop their tariffs completely, eliminate tariffs, And now there are 70 signatories. Almost all IT trade is duty-free. Trade policy reviews, the top 4 trading entities are reviewed every 2 years, and then 4 years, and then every member is reviewed every 6 years. It's a lot of very good information. Accession, it's not relevant, obviously, but basically it's a negotiation. China took a long time for all kinds of reasons, but it's a big process. These are the countries that came in since 1995: China, Russia, Taiwan, Saudi Arabia. The mostly big traders. Russia came in 2012, and these 21 countries, as I mentioned, are in the process, but they are all very small. So what's important about the WTO? Well, it was a single undertaking: sign one, sign all, except the plurilaterals. Much more significant for developing countries. Trade and services and intellectual property were brought in. Textiles were brought into the system. Textile trade is now governed by the regular rules. The exceptions for agricultural products were eliminated. Tariff barriers, we've now got agreements which are part of the single undertaking on technical barriers to trade, regulations, and sanitary and phytosanitary, which basically deal with food and drink. It's a true international organization, which the GATT never was. And it's enormously strengthened the dispute settlement system. First of all, no more single member blocking. So the country that loses can't block the decision. They've also created an appellate body, which, as its name implies, will hear appeals from decisions by the panels. And on the whole, it's done a very effective job, but at the moment it's not working because there's only 1 member left and there have to be at least 3. And the United States has been blocking nomination of new members. And with the consensus principle on that, that means it doesn't happen. It also introduced very strict time limits, which the old system did not have. I think the advantages are fairly obvious. Market access. Give an example. China, the United States gave China most favored nation treatment in 1989, I think, or 1990, when we started the rapprochement. But that was on a bilateral basis. It was every year was renewed by Congress. And if you were in business, you had no idea whether it would be continued after this year. And certainly there were times, particularly after the Tiananmen Square incident, when the human rights people opposed giving them continued MFN. They did get it, but it's a big battle. So it created a lot of uncertainty for people in business. Well, now, as part of the WTO, they have guaranteed market access. The United States can't block MFN treatment. It's a rules-based system, which laws generally produce certainty, and you've got access to dispute settlement. One of the first cases in the new system was brought by Costa Rica against the United States in relation to a textile quota that the United States had imposed. Costa Rica won the case and the United States dropped it. Well, if Costa Rica hadn't been a member of the WTO and didn't have access, what would have happened? I don't think much. It creates stable trade relationships. It can lock in economic reforms. It attracts foreign investment, and just the open market, more competition. We've talked about that as well. That is very good for consumers. It produces competition. So just for a few minutes, we're nearly at the end of this session. Doha. The focus was supposed to be on development. There was a strong feeling in the developing countries that the Uruguay round did not benefit them. The developed countries had out-negotiated them, and they were not doing well. It's an interesting, but probably too much detail to go into now. It didn't really work out that way, and in fact, it didn't produce anything. It was basically the developed countries against the developing countries. It produced one multilateral agreement, the trade facilitation agreement, which again we'll look at when we get to customs issues. It's not a very, well, as they say, it's not rocket science. It's really to try to make it easier to trade, to take down red tape, the sort of barriers that exist at customs. And then the Doha round was basically put to rest at the Nairobi Ministerial in 2015. There was some thought it could continue, but it didn't. And the problem here is non-agricultural products, mostly manufactured or minerals. The concern was that the developing countries weren't making enough cuts on their tariffs. mostly it was what was called water, was basically saying, well, we'll hold our tariff where it is now. We won't go up, but we also won't go down. In agriculture, again, there was a system of tariff cuts, and the developing countries, in the view of the developed countries, this is not my view, this is the view of the developed countries, asked for too many exemptions, and they wanted bigger subsidy cuts by the developed countries. I'm sorry, that should be developed. And in services, again, there wasn't enough to satisfy the developed countries. It was mostly, again, standstill, i.e. we will agree not to raise our barriers to service trade, but we won't reduce them either. That's sort of known as water. It's not very valuable. Okay, so what's going to happen in the future? I'm sure there'll be plenty of other speakers. And in fact, the very last session will be two of the leading trade experts in Washington, indeed, really in the world, who will be talking about the future. And this is my view. Others may have different views, but I don't think we'll see another multilateral agreement like the Uruguay round. I just think there's too much difference between the various members. What we will see, I think, is a two-speed approach, the so-called plurilateral agreements. The government procurement agreement, which we'll look at later this week, it's been revised, is mostly developed countries, and it's optional. And I think there are about 30 members now, but most developing countries haven't joined it. The information technology agreement, which we just looked at, that was mostly developed countries. And there are a couple now which are being negotiated, one on environmental goods. The difficulty is, what is an environmental good? The definition. The Chinese want bicycles included for obvious reasons. The Japanese want the Prius included. What about running shoes? Are they environmental goods? That's the difficulty. It's not going very far. Also, for some years, there's been an agreement on trade and services. Again, it's plurilateral. It's only 50 countries, mostly OECD countries. That's, I think, what we're going to see. It's sometimes called variable geometry, a two-speed approach. Some countries agree to liberalize, some don't. And then dispute settlement, if the United States, under the new administration, changes its view on the appellate body, which I certainly hope it will. And I think, generally speaking, as we know, President-elect Biden is a multilateralist, and I think he's certainly going to rejoin the WTO and the Paris Accord. And I think the betting probably is that he will allow the dispute settlement process to move forward. And we'll also, of course, see regional trade agreements, just particularly these so-called mega regional trade agreements. We've got the huge African agreement covering all countries in Africa. We've got the TPP minus the United States. And then just on Friday, the regional comprehensive economic partnership led by China. So this has become very important. Of course, a major reason for this is that as the Doha round was obviously beginning to fail, countries said, well, we'd like to get some free trade, not all, but at least some. And so that's a strong motive behind these regional trade agreements. President Trump's trade agenda, well, just bilateral rather than multilateral, pulling out of the TPP, and then renegotiating existing ones on the US, Mexico, Canada, which was the NAFTA. Not terribly major changes, but politically quite significant. And chorus, the Korean Free Trade Agreement, very minor changes to that, in fact. But anyway, this is the thing. Many more trade remedy cases. We don't need to go into this detail, but you can see there, national security cases, safeguards, many more dumping, countervail cases. As I said, the trade lawyers are now incredibly busy. As I said, President Trump's administration has refused to agree to the appellate body nominations. And at the moment, the Director General, another indication of the rather sorry state of the WTO, the Director General, Acevedo, retired earlier this year, a year before his term was up. I imagine he was just really very disappointed by the lack of progress. And most other candidates have, most other countries, sorry about the typo, most countries have agreed, but the United States is not supporting the one favored by most. Again, who knows what's going to happen in the new administration. Just summarizing liberal trade, there's no such thing as free trade. People talk about free trade, but there is no such thing. There are obviously restrictions on trade for the reasons that we've discussed. It stimulates growth. I mean, India is a classic example. Was it about 1990, I think it liberalized and has grown enormously. Chile was one of the first, Vietnam. It increases efficiency. Competition is good, most people believe, and it benefits consumers. Lower prices, more variety. We've talked about the political advantages of liberal trade. On the other hand, inevitably, if you lower trade barriers, there are going to be winners and losers. Some people are not going to succeed in the new increased competition, and that is a price to be paid. So I think I've just about, it's 9:30.
I just want to let you know, I've just promoted Warren. He's sitting there, and you're done.
I'm so that, yeah, I'm done. So how do we get Warren in?
He's online right now.
So, okay. So let me introduce our next speaker, Warren MARUYAMA. Hello, Warren. Warren is one of the leading trade lawyers in Washington. He worked in the Bush 1 administration at the National Security Council on trade issues, and then he was general counsel to the U.S. Trade Representative, so knows the WTO extremely well. He's now a partner in Hogan Lovells, one of the largest law firms in Washington. And Warren has been very clever. Most trade lawyers do dumping and countervailing duties. They're quite remunerative, but they can be pretty tedious. But Warren has managed to stay out of that and basically do political advising clients on the politics of trade, where trade is going. And so Warren's going to talk to us about free trade agreements and also the possible Biden trade policy. So Warren, all yours. And thank you very much for being here.
Well, thanks, Patrick, for the introduction. It's great, well, to manage to do everything virtually, and I commend ILI for finding a way to pull off this conference in the midst of COVID-19. So what I'm going to talk about is free trade agreements, and to some extent about the differences between the Biden and the Trump free trade agreement agendas, which also goes to some of the underlying differences between their two policies. So
Warren, you might want to put it into the slideshow mode. Do from the beginning. No. In the left.
The very furthest left. That's it.
Got it?
No. You see the button which says from the beginning?
Below, go down, that's it.
There.
We are, yeah.
Okay. So what I'm going to cover is sort of a brief backgrounder on traditional U.S. free trade agreement policy. Then what changed under President Trump, and things changed in a very dramatic way. And then take some speculative guesses on what's next under a President-elect Biden. And the reason that this is called Back to the Future is the future may look, hopefully, somewhat more like the past. So briefly tracing U.S. trade policy, in the initial years after World War II, the U.S. policy was shaped, just like everything else, by the past. And up on the top, you can see Senator Smoot and Representative Hawley, the authors of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. It wasn't the only cause, but it was one of the causes of the Great Depression and why it lasted for 15 years. So after World War II, the U.S. set out to create a much more multilateral trade system. So that led to the GATT, it's an open, non-discriminatory, rules-based trading system, and a series of GATT rounds that dramatically reduced tariffs. In the Tokyo round, the focus started to shift from tariffs, which had been brought down to pretty low levels, to non-tariff barriers like anti-dumping, standards, government procurement. And then in 1994, the crowning achievement of the GATT rounds, the World Trade Organization was created and brought services, agriculture, and intellectual property rights under the GATT WTO umbrella. In parallel with this, there were a series of free trade agreements, starting with a smallish one with Israel, Canada in 1988, the first really serious one, NAFTA in 1993, which was a huge free trade agreement and probably the biggest and most important one the US has ever done. And then under Bush 43 and President Obama, a series of smaller agreements with Latin America, the Middle East, and the Korea, which is probably the second biggest free trade agreement that we've done. Then you have Donald Trump, and the Trump administration, as one of its signature acts within, I think, 3 days of taking office, President Trump withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was President Obama's signature trade initiative, threatened to withdraw from NAFTA, the Korea Agreement, and the WTO, and very loudly proclaimed a focus to bilateral free trade agreements, which has led to a series of initiatives, although perhaps not quite as much as the president might have wanted. So what changed to drive this shift away from the WTO and toward free trade agreements? The first was the Doha round, which I think, as Patrick has laid out, was jinxed, flawed from the beginning. One of the biggest developments was that for most of the post-war period, the formula for a GATT round was the US and Europe had to reach an agreement. This was obviously becoming unsustainable with the greater role of developing countries, and it really collapsed at the Cancun Ministerial, where the US and EU came up with something called the Blue Box proposal, a pretty cynical proposal that wouldn't have done much to deal with agricultural subsidies. Brazil, India, South Africa, and others formed up a group of developing countries, shot down the US-EU proposal, and then, despite some efforts to rehabilitate it, it collapsed in July of 2008. One of the few benefits of which was I got to spend a month in Geneva hanging out at the Hotel de la Paix. So since then, the WTO has grown increasingly dysfunctional. There's been a salvage operation to try and retrieve some of the agreements, the Trade Facilitation Agreement. They're still working on the Trade and Services Agreement. There has been another round of Information Technology Agreement, and then the Environmental Goods Agreement. But the focus really shifted to what are called regional and mega-regional free trade agreements, the big ones. And so as you can see from the slide, just about every region, the US, Europe, Japan, China, Latin America, and Africa has joined the free trade agreement bandwagon. In parallel with this, and partly because of it, there's been a huge political backlash against globalization, against immigration and trade. And we've seen it in President Trump's America First policy, the claim that we've been disadvantaged by all of these trade agreements, and the UK's Brexit. And all of this has really shaken some of the underpinnings of the global trading system. So what's the traditional US approach? Really, the term free trade agreements is extremely broad, and it covers a really broad range of agreements. At one end of the spectrum, you have your basic free trade agreements. It's basically a focus on industrial tariff reductions, some very broad exceptions usually for import-sensitive products. Agriculture usually is carved out or in whole or in part, and they're sometimes framed as interim agreements to try and fit within GATT Article 24 and give them some semblance of WTO legality. Usually there's no dispute settlement system except for consultations. Then at the other end of the spectrum, you have advanced free trade agreements. And the major proponents of these are countries like the US and European Union. Here you have much broader product coverage. So it would cover industrial tariffs, agricultural market access, services, investment, usually with investor-state arbitration. And then in a lot of the agreements, particularly the US and EU ones, intellectual property rights. An advanced free trade agreement will have limited exceptions, and usually it will have a binding dispute settlement system. If you want to go one step beyond a free trade agreement, it takes you into the world of customs unions. There are only about 20. These are much, much harder to put together. The best examples of customs unions would be the European Union, CARICOM, Mercosur, and the Gulf Cooperation Council. And the difference with a customs union is that in a free trade agreement, each of the parties reduces their tariffs with each other, eliminates them to zero, ideally, but it keeps its own tariff schedule for third parties. In a customs union, there's an effort to have a common external tariff. So within the EU, each of the 27 EU member states has the same EU tariff. So tariff policy and trade policy are consolidated within the European Commission and more specifically within DG Trade. But pulling off a customs union requires a significantly higher degree of economic integration and coordination. And that's why they're much less common. So what I'll start with is the traditional US free trade agreement and with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And TPP, as it was called, is important both for what it was and what Trump rejected. So TPP was the idea of an Asia-Pacific regional FTA. It covered 12 countries from Asia and from Latin America, so Brunei, Chile, Singapore, New Zealand, Australia. The big thing about it was when Japan joined in 2013. Before that, it was sort of a smallish exercise that was intellectually interesting, but really didn't involve much trade or excite US business or agriculture very much. But when Japan joined, it really drove up the stakes. TPP was the centerpiece of President Obama's trade policy. It was the economic side of his Asia pivot, where he was going to switch the focus of US foreign policy from a traditional emphasis on Europe toward Asia. And the idea was to provide a US-based template for Asia-Pacific free trade that would bring together our key allies, the key democracies in the region, most of them democracies, I guess, and then countries that were committed to free markets. And implicitly, this was sort of quietly stated, not overtly stated, but it was definitely out there. The idea behind TPP was to counter China's growing economic influence and state capitalism. Again, President Trump withdrew from the agreement 3 days after taking office. There's a wonderful picture up there. I've used it in several places in this presentation of President Trump holding up his executive order directing one of my former lawyers, Maria Pagan, to withdraw from TPP. Maria being a career USTR lawyer and someone who had spent years working on TPP, but was given the honor of withdrawing from it. The other countries, led by Japan, decided to keep moving forward. So they signed eventually CPTPP 11. That's the Comprehensive and Progressive Trade Pacific Partnership. That is basically TPP minus a bunch of provisions that were important to the United States.
Warren, can I have a quick question? Was there any consideration in the early days of TPP of inviting India to join, or do you know if India ever expressed any interest in joining TPP? I'm not sure geographically, I suppose it's on the Pacific, but I mean, I'm sure we'll hear about this from the Indian speakers next week, but I just wondered if you had any background.
You know, I think the idea was that eventually India, as one of the bigger economies, would come in. But I think one of the calculations was that it probably wasn't ready for a US-style free trade agreement like TPP, since it would have required bringing down to zero with maybe a handful of exceptions, all of India's agriculture and industrial tariffs.
Yeah, thanks.
The U.S. did notify its intent to negotiate a U.S.-Japan free trade agreement, primarily driven by agriculture, which was afraid of being cut out of trade with Japan because of CPTPP. And interestingly, China's premier has expressed an interest in joining CPTPP, although it's unclear how serious that is. But that would be a major threat to the United States if it were actually to happen, since we could find ourselves being cut out of a lot of trade and a China-centric trade regime starting to take hold in Asia Pacific, which would be very detrimental for U.S. interests. So I'll briefly cover.
Right, Warren, can I just go back? Maybe you mentioned this, but do you have any sense, or maybe you'll come to this later, of whether President-elect Biden would seek to rejoin the TPP? There was a conference last week, and somebody said, I hadn't realized it was very unpopular in Congress, and the feeling was he probably wouldn't move quickly on TPP, if at all. Well, the new the CPTP.
Well, we'll get to that later, but
okay, sorry.
Biden has announced that he's going to pause free trade agreements. TPP would not have passed our Congress under Obama. I mean, President Obama was interested in having it passed, but it had some major issues. So those would have to be fixed. And yes, it was extremely unpopular. And so it's caught up in some of the economic nationalism that we talked about a couple of slides ago. So just to switch to some of the core elements of free trade agreements, the main one is tariffs and market access. So under GATT and WTO rules, a free trade agreement has to result in elimination of substantially all tariffs and market access barriers. In the US, this is taken seriously. So virtually all tariffs are eliminated with at most a handful of exceptions. But just to make this easier to swallow, what the US and most other countries will use is phase out periods where the bulk of the tariffs are eliminated on entry into force. That usually covers at least 70%, and sometimes much higher level of US tariff categories. And this is the least sensitive products where there's no or very little US domestic production, or the US industry doesn't care. Tariffs that are a little bit more sensitive will be phased out over 3 years, where there's some significant domestic production, 5 years, 10 years for the most import sensitive industrial products, things like textiles and apparel, footwear, autos and auto parts, and then 15 to 30 years for import sensitive agricultural products. And these will also be addressed through some other devices that are used mainly in the agricultural sphere to try and soften the transition. When you do tariff cuts, there's also something called staging. So you can normally stage a tariff cut by dividing it up. So then a 10% tariff that's cut over 5 years would go down by 2% each year. But you can also front end load it by having the whole thing take place in 2 years, 5% each year for 2 years, or you can back-end load it by having the entire cut come at the end of the 10-year, 5-year period. And that involves what's called going off a cliff, and it can lead to a much more difficult transition and political resistance. And again, you can have some exceptions from tariff cuts in some free trade agreements. There's a lot of things that are exempted. I believe that's true of quite a few of India's free trade agreements. But in US free trade agreements, it tends to be only a few products, mostly agriculture. The other part of negotiating a tariff is rules of origin. Since whenever you do a free trade agreement, you have to determine what types of products are eligible. And usually if a product contains too many non-free trade agreement ingredients or parts and components, that is, a lot of it is produced by in countries that aren't part of the free trade agreement, like say China, then it's ineligible for the duty preferences, for duty-free treatment. And there are various types of rules of origin. There's regional value content, which is the standard rule, typically somewhere around 30%. Substantial transformation, which is the ordinary customs rule, sort of case by case. Tariff shift, which is something the US experimented with in the Canada agreement and NAFTA, which is when a product changes tariff category, then it's eligible for as a FTA product. And then a variety of product-specific rules, that it's wholly produced, the origin of certain key components, and tracing. And rules of origin can be designed both to ascertain whether a product is legitimately part of a free trade agreement. They can also be structured to limit FTA access for certain parties, like the rules, auto rules in the US-Canada agreement, which have been kept in the NAFTA and then toughened up in the US-Mexico-Canada agreement under President Trump, were originally designed to limit the ability of Japanese auto producers who had major operations in Canada from putting together cars from kits containing parts and components that were mostly produced in Japan and shipping them duty-free to the United States. So Canada, NAFTA, and USMCA have all very stiff rules of origin for autos. Another part of free trade agreements is customs procedures or trade facilitation, with the broad goal of making sure that any tariff cuts aren't stymied by various customs practices. So it's designed to ensure transparency. It's designed to ensure trade facilitation, that is timely release of the goods. Advanced ruling, so there's some certainty about what the tariff is going to be. For the US, one of the big priorities is express delivery shipments, just because of FedEx, eBay, and other e-commerce retailers. So for that, the US wants expedited customs treatment and then a high de minimis, ideally tracking the US de minimis of $800. So a shipment that's worth less than $800 in the US is largely exempt from duties and from customs paperwork. And finally, impartial and transparent administration, just because customs operations in some countries are notorious for corruption or abuses.
Warren, if I can interrupt again, I heard that apparently Russia had baby food was duty-free coming into Russia, and apparently it was amazing how many cigarettes and how much alcohol the babies in Russia consumed. So, and I'm sure there was money under the table somewhere.
Well, that's probably beneficial corruption, but thing you don't want is for shipments of your exports to be held up by demands for bribes or delays in the paperwork. That means it sits for 14 days, and if it's an agricultural product, starts to rot. So one of the biggest U.S. priorities in
Mommy.
One of the biggest U.S. priorities in our free trade agreements is agricultural market access. And this tends to be one of the most sensitive issues for a lot of free trade agreements in some countries. And I think India would be an example, Japan, Korea, others. There's a lot of pressure to exclude agriculture or limit duty-free access for products that are heavily produced domestically. And the reason the US cares about this is we're a major exporter of a lot of agricultural products: beef, pork, poultry, grains, soybeans, vegetables, nuts, dairy. The US is all a big producer and exporter. We do have certain import sensitivities, and I think every country does. And those are concentrated around the sugar and to a certain extent the dairy sector. Although dairy has moved, used to be highly protectionist, now it's sort of schizophrenic because it's both a major exporter and it's very worried about imports. So agriculture is where you would find unusual special transition mechanisms. Longer tariff phase outs, quite often 10 to 25 years. A tariff rate quota where the duty-free access is limited by a quota. So the first, say, 100,000 tons would come in duty-free, but over 100,000 tons, it'll be subject to a higher tariff. And in Japan, where they have tariff rate quotas, sometimes you'll find extraordinarily high tariffs, like 800%, and that basically is prohibitive. Economists think it's somewhat better because, at least in theory, a good can be shipped over by paying the higher tariff, whereas under a pure quantitative quota, as soon as the tariff is exceeded, you're out of luck. Most US free trade agreements have what's called a special safeguard, where if there's an import surge, usually defined in quantitative terms, the tariff can snap back to its most favored nation rate. And then subsidies are permitted, what are called green box subsidies in the WTO. And a lot of times when a country opens up in the agricultural sector, it will try and effectively pay off its farmers by giving them a big transition payment or some form of subsidy. And this was done when the US opened up on things like tobacco and peanuts. And finally, you have in some US FTAs and in other countries' FTAs, complete exclusions for import sensitive products. And ours would typically involve sugar and dairy, mostly sugar. But getting over agriculture is one of the biggest political challenges in US free trade agreements. It's also a challenge for a lot of other countries that do free trade agreements. And in President Obama's transatlantic trade and investment partnership with Europe, the idea of a free trade agreement with Europe, political appointees tend to be very enthusiastic about this idea. You know, at least in the abstract, it makes a lot of sense. Career USTR officials tend to be very skeptical. They know how deeply embedded the EU's restrictions on US farm products are. And ultimately, when the negotiations ran into a brick wall on beef, chicken, genetically modified organisms, it basically sank the TTIP.
What, Warren, as I'm sure you know, one of the huge issues in the UK and the possible UK-US free trade agreement, though it doesn't look as if it's going very far, is chlorinated chicken. The United States chicken is chlorinated to remove the bacteria or whatever, And people in the UK are utterly opposed to this. And they say, the fact is that, Warren, you and I have eaten chlorinated chicken for many, many years, and we seem to be doing all right. But it's a huge scare tactic, the same with beef hormones. And the US, as you say, it's probably a lot of it is protectionist, but I think there's a real concern in the UK about chlorinated chicken. You see this all the time. So anyway, that's an example.
Yep, and I think dealing with chicken and beef and GMOs is one of the big challenges in the US-UK free trade agreement. The UK has been saying that it can deal with it, although it's also telling the population that nothing is going to change. So we'll see exactly how they skin that cat. Mm-hmm. Services, again, the US is a big services exporter. There are really two types of services free trade agreements. The US, TPP, EU, Canada are what are called negative list, where all services are covered unless one of the parties takes what's called a non-conforming measures exception. There are also certain standard exclusions, air transport, which is covered by a separate regime, government procurement, immigration, which is deemed for most countries politically too hot to handle. But a negative list, the presumption is everything is covered, then the negotiation focuses on non-conforming measures exceptions. For the US, the big priorities are sectors like insurance, express delivery, and increasingly cross-border data flows. In contrast, the General Agreement on Trade and Services in the WTO and many non-US free trade agreements, when they cover services at all, are what are called positive list. So in a positive list agreement, a service is only covered if it's affirmatively listed in a party's schedule. So it's more restrictive, but it gives the government greater scope, control over the scope of its commitments. And it leads to more limited coverage for particularly things like innovative services, which are developed and were not foreseen at the time of the negotiations, or for politically sensitive types of services. So I know India is a big services exporter. It may also have political sensitivities on certain types of services, but in structuring Indian free trade agreements, I suspect that exactly which regime to go under is a major issue. Financial services in US free trade agreements is broken out as a separate chapter. The main reason is that our US Treasury Department did not like the broader scope of the services chapter, and it wanted more exceptions to protect the regulatory prerogatives of US financial regulatory agencies. So it has exceptions for prudential measures, exceptions for monetary credit and exchange rate policies, and much more limited access to investor state arbitration. In the NAFTA, the US for the first time took our model bilateral investment treaty and incorporated it in a free trade agreement as an investment chapter. So what the investment chapter does is provide certain legal protections for foreign investors. National treatment, which is one of the most important, most favored nation treatment. You can't discriminate between different countries. Minimum standards of treatment, which is sort of an international due process obligation, and then a requirement of reasonable compensation for government expropriations. All of this is subject to what's called investor state arbitration. And investor state arbitration allows an aggrieved investor to challenge government violations of free trade agreement rules. This goes before a panel of international arbitrators. And unlike normal free trade agreement or trade or WTO disputes, the arbitrators can actually award monetary damages. it's turned out to be hugely controversial, in part because a lot of the investor-state arbitration cases have challenged various environmental regulations as expropriations, as discriminatory, or violations of minimum standards of treatment. The advantage of an investment chapter is for multinational companies. It can compensate for a weak rule of law, particularly in developing countries with arbitrary legal systems. From a developing country standpoint, this sort of added legal reassurance can lead to increased foreign direct investment, but it's become, as noted, hugely politically controversial. There's been a big backlash among many progressives that ISDS is basically a tool for big multinational companies, and it's turned into something of a political albatross. So one of the provisions of US free trade agreements and EU free trade agreements is what are called TRIPS plus IPR rules. So TRIPS plus means agreements that go beyond the WTO agreement on trade-related aspect of intellectual property rights. One area where this would take place is pharmaceuticals with longer terms of protection, special rules on patent term extension and linkage, and then drug pricing and reimbursement rules, which require transparency and independent review. US also wants longer copyright terms, life plus 70 years. This is primarily because of Walt Disney. In the area of geographic indications, the US and EU have conflicting provisions. The US wants to limit the scope for geographical indication protections. The EU tries to expand them just because the EU is one of the biggest proponents of broad geographical indication protections, particularly given its wines and spirits, cheeses, and other food products. So the EU would view things like Parmesan cheese as a geographical indication. So US or Argentine or Chilean Parmesan cheese could not be sold in the EU and labeled as Parmesan cheese. US IP chapters also have enhanced enforcement, and they have a special provision on intellectual service providers that requires the takedown of pirated material, but also protects them against liability. And one of the big controversies in the IP provisions of US free trade agreements has been access to medicines, particularly after the AIDS epidemic, and restrictions on production of generic medicines by some developing countries, including India. So now we come to the juicy part of this, which is the differences between President Trump and President-elect Biden. So President Trump was probably the first president in a century to run openly on an anti-trade platform. He viewed most of our trade agreements as a disaster. He went after NAFTA and TPP. He was very critical of, and still is critical of, China. His campaign was characterized as provocative threats to pull out of NAFTA, pull out of TPP, and pull out of the World Trade Organization. And all of this resonated a lot with blue-collar US workers who have taken a hit in the last 30 years and blame a lot of it on jobs moving offshore to places like Mexico, China, and to a certain, much lesser extent, to India. Despite the threats, the only agreement that President Trump withdrew from is TPP. On NAFTA, Ultimately, the administration decided to renegotiate the deal, make it better. And that culminated in a US-Mexico-Canada agreement in 2018. The big change was in the auto rules of origin, which were toughened up quite a bit. The administration had originally proposed that the agreement sunset after 5 years. It was replaced by a 16-year term and then review after 6 years. Investor-state arbitration, again, has become very controversial, and it was limited to certain sectors: energy, mining, telecommunications. And Canada was also excluded from ISDS on the theory that it has a strong legal system. On government procurement, this was one of Canada's big asks. It wanted access to to state and local government procurement, didn't get it, and eventually it opted out. So government procurement chapter doesn't apply to Canada, although the US and Canada are still, at least at this point, part of the WTO's government procurement agreement. The upside of US-Mexico-Canada was it incorporated certain strengthened chapters from the TPP on state-owned enterprises. That's a chapter that's primarily aimed at China, regulatory transparency, small and medium enterprises, and digital trade, and updated a number of chapters, again, based on TPP, because US FTAs have evolved steadily over the 25 years since NAFTA was negotiated and put into force. So in the end, despite the talk, the changes to the original NAFTA are limited. The US dropped some of its more extreme demands for elimination of dispute settlement, elimination of Canada's cultural exception, which is, I think, primarily something to provoke the Canadians, and a 5-year hard sunset. What it did get was much tougher auto rules of origin, a very modest increase in US access to the Canadian dairy market, and much tougher limits on investor-state arbitration. For President Trump, you know, whatever its limits, it's a great deal. And he's touted it during his presidential campaign as a groundbreaking achievement. And again, this is a message that really does appeal to many blue-collar voters. In the end, the new agreement probably isn't going to change things all that much. It may change things somewhat in the auto sector, but a lot of the jobs that were headed overseas probably are not coming back. The most astounding thing is, as I think this seminar will get into later, US free trade agreements have to be approved by Congress. And this is usually the biggest challenge in negotiating a free trade agreement, is putting together something that will get congressional approval. And since NAFTA had been regarded as politically radioactive, a lot of people, including me, thought that it would be a huge fight to try and get USMCA approved, particularly given how close recent trade votes have been, with a lot of them passing by just 1 or 2 votes in our House of Representatives. But ultimately, Robert Lighthizer, the US Trade Representative, was able to strike a deal with House Speaker Pelosi and the Congressional Democrats, where he made some changes. He added a labor rapid response mechanism that allows US unions to challenge abuses of union rights in Mexico. He dropped 10 years of data exclusivity for biologics, which had been one of the Senate Republicans' core demands before. Added requirements on steel and aluminum content for autos. he was forced to address past blocking of NAFTA dispute settlement panels. That was fixed somewhat reluctantly by Lighthizer, but it means that disputes have to go forward now, and clarified the burden of proof in labor and environmental disputes. And the result, a very good one, was that it passed overwhelmingly, 385 to 41. That's just amazing in terms of bipartisan support, and goes back to where things were actually when I started out in this business in the 1980s, when agreements were not very controversial and both Democrats and Republicans supported them. Passed the Senate 89 to 10 with only one Republican, a diehard free trader, opposed. And it entered into force on July 1, 2020. So this is a big win for President Trump, for Ambassador Lighthizer, and for House Speaker Pelosi. For the other Trump free trade agreements, Korea, as Patrick noted, was successfully renegotiated with some very minor changes. For Japan, the US and Japan achieved an early harvest agreement that Japan agreed to give the US the tariff cuts that it was providing in CPTPP. That means that US things like beef and pork aren't going to get crowded out by Canada, Australia, or New Zealand. But you know, there's been no progress toward a comprehensive free trade agreement, and the thing seems likely to be stuck for some time as a limited agreement that's basically agriculture. The US and EU launched some talks after then EU President Juncker visited the White House. Those started out with talk about a comprehensive FTA, or at least a comprehensive FTA on industrial tariffs, but eventually became a mini deal, and a very mini deal that's focused on lobster tariffs. And one problem with the EU is that there are some major disputes lurking at the end of this year on Airbus subsidies and digital services taxes. Lighthizer did launch a free trade agreement with the UK. That apparently is progressing, but one of the challenges there is that Trade Promotion Authority, which would allow an expedited vote on a UK FTA, runs out on July 1, 2020. And that it can be very hard to get another grant of TPA from our Congress. So it's unclear what happens there. And he also launched the first effort to negotiate a free trade agreement by the United States with an African country, that's Kenya. After some visits by President Trump, the US and Brazil and the US and India announced their intent to do trade negotiations, not free trade agreement negotiations, but trade agreements, but that's likely to turn into very limited deals. So there's been big action so far by President Trump. His biggest accomplishment probably being USMCA, US-China Phase 1 deal, pulling out of TPP, and a bunch of tariffs. He gets incompletes on US-Japan, a US-China Phase 2 agreement, US-UK, and US-Kenya. And you know, what's become clear is the president likes doing deals, and he's prepared to use threats and chaos and uncertainty to get them. He is, in that way, an effective negotiator. So what's going to happen under President-elect Biden? So Biden's has sort of studiously avoided the trade, getting too specific on his trade agenda. He's announced that there's going to be a pause on new free trade agreements. There's going to be a pause anyway because Trade Promotion Authority runs out on July 1. He's going to expand Buy America, and he's going to work with US allies to try and put pressure on China. One of the criticisms of the Trump trade policy, it's been a go-it-alone policy where we've tried to do it all by ourselves. and not work with allies. So probably a greater focus on multilateral institutions like the WTO, and on the security side on things like NATO. The China tariffs probably...
Can I just ask a quick question about the WTO? As I mentioned in the first session, the Trump administration has blocked the dispute settlement process by refusing to agree to nominations to the appellate body. Do you think the Biden administration will change that? I mean, a number of countries feel there need to be reforms in dispute settlement, but I just wonder if you have any thoughts on where that will go.
I'm actually pretty skeptical. I think the concerns about the appellate body and overreaching are bipartisan. And what the other countries are talking about in terms of reforms are small potatoes in terms of what Lighthizer wants, and probably what a Democratic administration is going to want. Mm-hmm. So the China tariffs are likely to stay. I don't see any prospect for changes in China's systemic policies. Probably a Biden administration is going to restore more of an interagency decision-making process, so it'll be more predictable, fewer surprises. In Trump, most decisions were made in his office with a handful of cabinet members like Ambassador Lighthizer, Commerce Secretary Ross, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, and National Economic Council Director Kudlow, and White House Advisor Peter Navarro. So things would jump from the lower levels of the bureaucracy all the way up to the Oval Office. And basically it would come down to a decision by Trump. Trade is still an incredibly tough issue for Democrats. It splits the two wings of their party, moderates and progressives. Organized labor, even though its membership is starting to slide over toward Trump, and the Republicans, is still a bunch of trade skeptics and is a major Democratic stakeholder. And I would classify Biden as an internationalist. He chaired the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for years, but moving a trade agenda would require a major expenditure of political capital. So some of the Trump FTAs may survive the UK and Kenya. Some are likely to remain stalled. That would include Japan and the EU. The biggest question for me is whether he makes a decision to rejoin the CPTPP, and having RCEP come into effect with China is a potentially big threat to the United States and could put pressure on him to re-engage with the Asia Pacific. If he does decide to do anything, he needs to get a new grant of Trade Promotion Authority. He's going to come under pressure from the progressives to do stronger labor and environmental rules. On the other hand, some of that could be very off-putting to Republicans. And again, usually you need bipartisan votes. So at this point, I would say US trade policy probably gets more predictable, more normal, but still remains a big muddle. So thank you very much. And with that, I think we've got 5 minutes for questions.
Let's see what we've got. Yeah, let's see the Q&A. Well, one question is there a time period for FTAs to become active? And my understanding is that the norm is 10 years in the one of the Uruguay round interpretations.
Usually once a free trade agreement has been, there's no definite time period, I think, or at least I'll check on that, but I don't think there is a definite time period. Usually once you've done one, people want the benefits. So, but at least in the US, what USTR has found is that if you put a free trade agreement into effect, you lose all your leverage on all of the implementation issues, because usually implementation of an FTA, particularly with a country that has multiple trade barriers, is another major exercise. But if you put it into force too early, then you lose all your leverage, and your only recourse is filing a dispute, which can take several years and throws it over to the lawyers, so you never know exactly what's going to happen. So in the U.S., the practice is to sign the agreement, have it approved by Congress, and then have it go into an implementation phase where USTR, primarily the lawyers, would work with the other countries to make sure that they fully implemented the agreement. One problem with NAFTA is that, or the USMCA, is that it was sort of rushed into force to give the president a talking point on the campaign trail. And as a result, a number of implementation issues were put aside temporarily. And I think USTR is struggling with those right now.
Yeah, another question is, why did Trump feel that TPP was discriminatory? My impression was it wasn't discrimination. It was Trump's view that bilateral agreements were better than multilateral, that you got more leverage. Now, of course, TPP was already signed when he pulled out. And there's certainly a belief, and I'm not taking a position on this, but many people feel that many of Trump's actions, not just in trade, were designed to really undo things that Obama had done. There was I don't know if that's something, but I mean, what was behind the withdrawal from TPP?
No, I think more than anything else, President Trump is a political genius as a gut level politician. And he could sense that a lot of voters out there are very skeptical about trade agreements. And this goes back to where we started with economic nationalism. And TPP was a convenient whipping boy. I'll note that former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who was the Democratic candidate, while she was Secretary of State, was a big proponent of TPP, but flipped on it during her campaign and became a major critic of the agreement. I'm not sure people really trusted her on that, but Clinton turned on it as well. And so I think that they were mainly reading the sort of political temperature and giving people what they wanted to hear. What we've heard since from some people who are insiders in the Trump administration is that the president is not necessarily set in stone in opposing TPP and might have been willing to take it with some changes. Although now that he appears to have lost the election, apart from some diehard Trump supporters, it doesn't sound like he's going to get a chance.
Right. Now, here's an interesting question arising out of the first session this morning, my session. How are ethics looked at in reciprocity? I was explaining that reciprocity is the key to the whole system, and I used just a theoretical example of cars and wine, the United States getting lower tariffs on cars from France and US lowering its tariff on wine. And so why, wine and cars, one is related to pollution and the other is related to addiction. Well, that's an interesting point. Now, I want to make it clear, which perhaps I didn't, this is a completely theoretical example, but it's an interesting question. But I think my answer would be that ethics aren't really taken into account in the sense of negotiating trade agreements. But Warren, you have much more experience than I do. So
I've never heard an ethical issue come up in a free trade agreement. The whole thing of free trade agreements is there are two big considerations. One is economics and reciprocity, or feeling like you've gotten enough out of your trading partners to balance out what you're having to give up to them in terms of tariff cuts. And the other one is politics, since one of the main considerations if you're a US trade negotiator is whether you're going to have the votes to get the thing approved by our Congress, since you know the thing is going up for a vote. And so the last days of free trade agreements, in my experience, are all about getting the votes and making sure that you've taken care of important congressmen and senators.
Yeah. Another question, does the termination of a BIT affect trade agreements? If it's a freestanding BIT, just an agreement on bilateral investment, and not part of a free trade agreement, then I think the answer would, my answer would be no. But again,
yeah, I agree with you, Patrick. You know, bilateral investment treaty is separate from a free trade agreement. Provisions from our model BITs, because the U.S. does have a model bilateral investment treaty, have been incorporated in our free trade agreements with some modifications. But there has been some cutbacks in USMCA that we've seen in the scope of investor state arbitration, but it's really two separate worlds.
That's what I would say. Yeah. There's just two more if we got time. What is the impact of the U.S.-China trade war on the U.S. foreign trade policy? I suppose it's part of the foreign trade policy of the Trump administration.
Yeah, and I think the concerns about China are bipartisan. Mm-hmm. So I don't think this is going away under Biden.
No, I think that the view is that unlike President Trump, who's been taking unilateral action against China and threats, that the Biden administration will try to get the allies, Japan, the EU, and others, as a concerted effort to put pressure on China. That seems to be the view. I don't know, again, if that's your impression.
Yeah, he's definitely going to try and work with our allies. He probably has a better shot at it because I think the concerns about China, both in terms of its actions in the South China Sea, on the India-China border, on the Senkakus with Japan, and are broadly shared. And you're seeing increasing concern in a lot of industries in Europe, Japan, Latin America about Chinese subsidies and other high-handed economic actions. And, you know, China seems to be in the middle of a major case of Chinese nationalism, which doesn't go over very well with your neighbors or trading partners. On the other hand, whether our the other countries will be willing to really step it up to put pressure on China is an open question, and that's going to turn on Biden's diplomacy.
Right. There are just two more quick questions, and I hope everybody's okay just going on a couple of more minutes as Warren is giving us more time. Does the pandemic give a new tenor to RCEP? Do you think it will impede access to COVID-related tools? I suppose that things like medicine, vaccines. I think it's too early to say. I have no idea whether RCEP, I have not read the whole thing, deals at all with COVID, whether it mentions it, but I would guess that would be covered by exceptions, if any restrictions.
Yeah, I have not read RCEP either. I think the one thing that's come out about COVID is that there's a lot more focus on supply chains for pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and medical supplies, particularly with the shortages that emerged and the clear dependence on China. Mm-hmm. So regardless of what happens under RCEP, I think there's going to be an effort to diversify supply chains and also make sure that there's sufficient domestic production.
Yeah, and the supply chains are closer to home.
Yes.
Yeah.
With trusted trading partners.
Yeah. What is the difference between a BIT and an FTA? I mean, the simple answer is a BIT deals with investment, FTA deals mainly with trade, but just to confuse things slightly, as Warren said, but most US free trade agreements and others as well do now include a BITS type provisions on investment. So there's sort of an overlap, but a pure BIT only deals with investment, does not deal with trade at all, whereas an FTA is focused largely on trade.
That's right.
Yep. Okay. Warren, thank you so much for your time. It's been a wonderful exposition. It's a complicated area. Obviously, we could spend a week on free trade agreements quite easily, but we don't have the time. But I hope you found this helpful. And tomorrow we'll be talking about the basic rules, the GATT rules, MFN, national treatment, etc. So well, I guess you're about to go to bed, so have a good night. We will hope to have a good day in this very, very strange world we're living in right now, where nobody knows what's happening. Okay, thank you all.
And it's been an honor to join you today, and best of luck negotiating many more free trade agreements.